Hi, my name is Matt Breunig, and I've been a jeweler for the past 25 years. I am here today at Cool Tools to help you make a trillion cut bezel set ring out of sterling silver. I hope you enjoy. Okay, today we're going to be using a Smith little torch, a chasing hammer, a chasing tool, a flat steel block, round nose pliers, half round pliers, flat pliers, standard needle nose pliers, a solder pick, a small bezel tool, shears, a bezel pusher, a burnisher, a pair of snips, a ring clamp, two different saw blade thicknesses, 8/0 and 4/0, a saw frame, various sanding sticks, a barrette file, a half round file, a flat file, both number 2 cut, two different grits of sanding discs, a sanding drum with sandpaper on it, and two different grits of pumice stones, and another bezel pusher. For soldering, we're going to use a ceramic soldering pad, 2 cross-lock tweezers with a tweezer holder, a mask to protect ourselves from fumes while soldering. We're going to use copper tweezers in the Pickle here. We're using a combination of boric acid and denatured alcohol, flux, and 2 solder picks. These are the materials you're going to need for making the ring. This is 16 gauge silver wire. This is silver bezel wire, and hard, medium, and easy sterling silver solder. It's important to remember safety while you're soldering. There's fumes produced not only by the boric acid and alcohol, but also by the solders. So it's important to wear an N95 mask or a respirator, or you can use a fume extractor if you like. So I'm going to start off with making the 2 bands that support the trillion top of the ring. And by doing that, we're using 16 gauge wire, which is pretty malleable, easy to move. We're going to make it about a 6.5, so we're going to start a little bit smaller than that. I'm wrapping it around the ring mandrel. So that it is a basic ring shape. I'm going to take the snips. This will cut a flat edge on one side. And so now we have a flat edge that we're going to create our seam right here. So I'm going to clean up the seam where I'm going to make the solder right here, and I'm going to use this flat medium grit disc. Now to get a nice tight fit, I'll take the ring, push both ends a little past one another, and then bring them out back, move them back and forth until you have that centered. So now we're going to hold that with our cross-lock tweezers, put our mask on, dip it in the boric acid and alcohol, and that's probably about a 20-to-1 mixture, primarily denatured alcohol. I'm going to make a small adjustment on my seam. Now the seam I'm going to put at the base of the ring, so I'm going to use a hard solder. That's a higher melting temperature, but it's also more durable. This is a number 7 torch tip that I'm using with a little torch. They go from 7, which is the widest flame, on down to number 1, which is a very fine flame. I like the larger frame, especially while working with sterling silver. I'm going to add a little more boric acid and alcohol right there, and I'm going to use a flux. I'm putting this right on the seam. I like to heat it up so that the flux bubbles a little bit at the seam. You'll notice that often I'm supporting my hand so that there's less shaking. I'll support my hand on the bench pin or up against the bench, and I'll do the same with the torch as well. And we've made our solder. We're going to drop this in Pickle. It's important to remember to remove the ring from the Pickle with copper tweezers. If you use steel tweezers, it tends to infect the Pickle, and then you'll have your sterling silver looking pink when you're done, which is kind of undesirable. It just requires more cleanup. All right, I've gone ahead and fabricated a second ring, and what I'm going to do now is make sure that they're both the same size. They're both nice and round on the mandrel, just a little bit over 6.5. And that's the same. So what we're going to do now is we're going to solder the two together so that we're creating the base for the bottom of the ring. I put the cross locks opposite of where my seam was with the hard solder, because I'm going to solder the two of them together like this. So we'll dip one in the boric acid and prep it, let it extinguish. And then the second one. Now we're going to use a slightly lower temperature solder. This is medium solder. So it's going to melt at a lower temperature than the hard solder where our seam already is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and charge the bottom of both of these rings with solder. Here's our two pieces of medium solder. Flux. See how that bubbles up? And then I remove the flame. I want it to kind of be a white appearance, not black. If it's black, you have to back out and reflux it. All right, we got that one charged. You saw it flow. You can see that I've got a blob of medium solder right there at the bottom seam, and I'm going to go ahead and quench it. Just a little heat will get that flux right where you want it. Get an angle that you're comfortable with, and you may even want to practice this ahead of time before you bring the torch into play. You're going to have both of those right there where you have your two little blobs of solder right up next to each other, and then heat them up and they're going to flow together. I'm going to charge both with just a little bit of flux. A little goes a long way with flux. The primary purpose of flux is getting the solder to flow where you want it to. So if you don't want to have it dripping down the side of your ring. And then we have a seam between the two rings. Now we're going to make the bezel for the stone itself. This bezel wire is really nice because it already has a bevel in it. So that's where the girdle of the stone, the very edge of the stone, will be sitting, and that is also your seat. So I'm going to create our first angle for the triangle. I like to put the stone upside down, then often get a bird's eye view from above to see how that angle is looking. This is where it gets tricky, is making the second angle, but you don't have to be perfect because silver is very soft, malleable, and forgiving. So we're going to get it approximately. We're just going to start the angle. We're not going to make a really sharp corner yet. We're going to get a bird's eye view again, looking from above. I can see that I need to move my angle out a little further. So I'm going to work from the opposite side. And I'm using the flat pliers here to do this. Just a little bit at a time. And if you're unhappy with the way it's going, you can always round that corner back out. Getting a basic triangular shape here. And I can see that my angle number 2 is a little too short on this distance here. So I'm going to use half round pliers and round that out a little bit. Now we have a basic shape that ought to be enough material to make the bezel. Spend a little time adjusting the bezel to where you're comfortable. Usually having a little bit more material than less is the way to go because you can always make a second cut through the bezel material to make your solder, which I'm going to do now. Set that aside. I'm using a 4/0 saw blade. And the way that I like to put a saw blade together, you want to make sure that the teeth are going the pointy way down. And I start with the top clamp. And I push with my chest against the bench, tighten the bottom clamp. The indication that it's tight is that sound. I like to leave the stone in place when I'm making the cut, but if you're more comfortable having the stone out, you can certainly do that. And what I do to protect the stone is I make a cut beyond my first bezel stop, so that if I cut through this piece on the back, that bezel piece is going to protect my stone as I get through that. I like to work vertically with my saw blade, moving up and down, and really slowly. And then stop. You can see that I've made a line through that bezel wire. I'm going to bend it and see if it'll snap off, which it does. And we're going to open that bezel back up. Don't worry, we're going to be reshaping it to our stone here in a moment. So what I'm going to be doing, because we made this side here a little bit long, I'm going to be trimming back using the medium grit sanding disc. You can certainly use a file for this process. Rotary tools are a little bit quicker. So just like with the rings that you made, you want to make a nice, neat seam. You want everything to be a nice, smooth seam between the two pieces. So I've got the two seams sanded and I'm adjusting for fit, similar to the ring. I'm pulling back a little bit and letting the tension close the gap. Using half round pliers to adjust. Now I can see that there's a little bit of space in my seam, so what I'm going to use is my saw to cut through there and make it a nice even seam. Notice that I'm moving my fingers back and away from the bezel so that when this cuts through, hopefully I will not cut my finger. And there we have it. I release the bottom clamp of the wire, or the saw frame, and then I pull my blade right out. So I cut right down the line there, and we've got a nice, pretty tight seam. It may look like this side is a little bit long, but we're going to make some adjustment for that to the stone. Now we're going to solder that in place, and we're going to use hard solder again, the higher melting temperature. Quench. I have my bezel soldered, and now I'm going to do some shaping. I'm going to try and make primarily a triangle, but this stone is a trillion, and what's special about trillions is they are triangular shaped, but they have rounded outside edges. So what I'm doing is I'm using my flat pliers to make as close to an equilateral triangle as possible. Now, to give it the rounded outside edge, I use a small bezel tool and just press in very lightly. You're just bringing the three walls out slightly more rounded. Until you heard the stone click into place. Now it fits right in there. And we're going to do some cleanup. Got the stone out. I turned the disc around so that we're going to be working at this angle. So what I'm doing is I'm removing some of the excess hard solder that's right at the seam. Try and keep the tool as flat as possible. Now I'm going to switch to the fine sanding disc. Working the same way. It's important to keep the tool moving so that you're not holding the sanding disc in one particular place for too long. If you just run this at full RPM and then dig out, you're going to end up with a crease right at your seam, and that's not what you want. Now I'm going to use some sandpaper on that seam. This is even finer sandpaper. This is 1200 grit sandpaper. You can see that that seam is smoothing out. We're going to do all three sides so that it's a even transition all the way around. And after you have it filed down to how you like it with the 1200, you can follow up with another stick. This has got a 3M cloth on it, and this is going to bring it to a nearly high polish. So we're going to finish shining up the outside of the bezel and then fit it to the ring. I like to put the seam at the back. So on this piece, the seam where I put the hard solder is right along this side here. Now the tension of the two rings is what's holding that in place. Just like when making a seam for the bezel or the ring, you pull the two pieces out and then push them back and then pull them out again, and then that creates a tension that holds the bezel in place, and that looks pretty good. I think that we're about ready to solder. So I got my bezel in place and centered. I'm going to dip it in the boric acid and alcohol. In this case, I like to hold the bezel downward when I ignite it, and then that way all that boric acid and alcohol is moving down the ring towards the bezel, and that's going to help with the flow of our solder. For this application, I'm using easy solder, which is the softest, most low temperature melting solder. So what's handy about these hot picks is they have a cupped end at the end of the point. And they come in three different sizes, 3, 2, and 1, 3 being the largest. So I'm going to dip this in boric acid and alcohol and ignite it. And what that does is it helps the solder adhere to the pick itself. As you heat it, you can see that it falls right into the cup, right at the end of the pick. And I can even set that aside. And I'm going to try and focus my heat on heavier material, that being the ring. The bezel is a little bit thicker, or thinner, excuse me, than the wire of the ring. So you can see that I start with kind of a fluffy flame, and then I'll kick up the heat a little bit. We have it fluxed. I'm supporting my hand to try and stay as steady as possible. See that heat is primarily down on the ring, and there it went. I'm going to heat it just a little bit more on this side to get that solder to come over around the corner. And there it went. Now we're going to quench it and do the back side of the bezel. You can even dip the hot pick down into the flux. It gives it a little bit more adhesion to the end of the pick, especially when you're going to line up and do a couple solders at the same time. I think I'm going to do 3 pieces of solder. I'm going to start the 2 sides. Getting it to stick is the tricky bit. Remember, if that flux turns black, go ahead and quench it. When in doubt, back out. If your flux is dirty, you'll never get that solder to flow where you want it to. All right. Here again, focusing the heat primarily down below, waving it around. You can see the solder starting to flow. It all flowed kind of at once, straight across, and we're going to quench it. All right, so now what I'm going to be doing is cleaning up along the solder seam here and on the front. And in this particular, this is just like the fine sanding disc. This one in particular is kind of worn out. You can see the kind of the soft edge just because it's been used a lot. So what that's going to do, a sanding disc that's a little bit more worn won't be removing as much material, and then also the benefit is it's gonna make a nice buffered edge against that solder seam. Now as you're cleaning up, if you see any pits, things like that starting to form, it's a good idea to reheat the solder to the point where it's almost ready to flow, and then that will reduce the amounts of pits on the edge of that solder seam. Looks like we lucked out with this one and not any solder pits to speak of. So we've kind of burnished that side. The two other sides are going to be a little bit more forgiving because there's not solder along the whole edge. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to the one that's not worn out. I'm going to take some of the bottom edge off these walls. They're a little bit sharp, so we're just going to go at a slight angle, maybe about a 45-degree angle, just to reduce some of that sharpness there. Moving really slowly. There again, you don't want to have the RPMs really high on something like this because it's easy to make a gouge. And of course, you can do a lot of this work with sanding sticks as well. Testing with my finger to see if there's any edge along that bottom. That feels pretty good. So we're going to follow up. Slowly go around with a 1200 grit. There again, just like when the bezel was loose, kind of following that curve, working it over, making it nice and smooth. Now keep in mind, this doesn't have to be high polish because there's still more work to do with the setting of the stone, which we're going to get to really quickly. This is a great time if you see anything ugly, especially on that solder seam, to go ahead and correct that. You've got it sanded down about as much as you want to with a 1200 grit sandpaper. You can transition to this 3M polishing cloth. And this is just on a standard stick. You could use an old ruler, and I use this alligator tape to hold it on. You can also use a rubber band. I used to use staples to staple the polishing cloth on the stick, and I found that often if there's a staple here, you might accidentally rub the staple against the piece you're working on. So that happened to me 2 or 3 times, and I decided I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to use tape or rubber band, something that's not sharp and can gouge the surface. All right, and I think we're ready to set. So what I've done to my ring clamp, this is a standard ring clamp, and this is pretty much the same. And what I've done is I've altered the end of it a little bit to fit into the end of the bench pin here. And the reason for doing that is that when I put the ring in here, it kind of supports it while I'm doing work with the setting tools and things like that. It keeps it nice and level. It's important to know that you know, just because a tool comes a certain way doesn't mean that you can't adjust it to your liking. Because I just had to use it to pick the stone up. I mean, I have it placed here now, so we can just not even mention this. Is that cool?
Yeah, I'm rolling, yeah.
Okay. All right, so I have the stone there, and I want it to sit down in there evenly. So I'm going to press down very carefully. And then see our starting point. You can see that the stone sits a little bit low in that bezel. So we're going to remove a little bit of excess material from the top of the piece. There's two ways of doing this. You can use a saw blade, but I prefer the method of using a sanding disc. If you try and cut a very thin edge off the top of it, often you can cut a little bit too much. Of course, if you have way too much excess material, it's best to use your saw frame. But in this case, I'm just going to use the sanding disc and sand it down some. All right, I've reduced the height of my bezel. The special thing about a trillion as well is that it kind of curves down to the point. So I'm going to do a little bit more adjustment while the stone is in place. Here again, you want to be really careful. If you're not comfortable with working with a sanding disc right next to your stone, remove the stone to do this portion of it. So I'm sanding a little bit more at the corners. You can also use a file if you prefer, but there again, got to be very careful not to rub the file up against the facet of the stone because you'll give it a little scratch. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an angle along the bezel wall. So the wall comes up, and what I'm going to do is make an angle so that it's thinner towards the top, because that's where I'm going to be pushing with a bezel pusher. So you're sharpening the top of this bezel wall. I like to do a little bit and then rotate to another side. There again, if you are not comfortable using the sanding disc, you can use a file. I'm leaving the bezel wall a little less sharp towards the corners of the stone, because we're going to be doing a little bit more removal of material at the corners. That's what's kind of complicated about setting a pointy stone. All right, I've reduced the height of the bezel wall, more so at the corners where the point of that stone kind of dips down a little bit in height. And got the side walls all sharpened. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to relief the corners of the bezel. And this is where the 8/0 saw blades come into play. Previously, when I was cutting on the ring and the bezel, I was using a 4/0 saw blade. So what I'm using here is an 8/0, which is skinnier, as the numbers go up, the gauge goes down. So an 8/0 saw blade is probably about half of the thickness of a 4/0. It's much easier to break one of these saw blades because they're thinner, but it'll make a laser thin cut, and that's what we need in the corners of this. You do have to be a little bit more careful putting these saw blades into the frame because there again, them being half the thickness, they are easier to break. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the point of the stone, and what I mean by that is the facets come together and they make, I guess we'll call it a reverse keel, like the keel of a ship. And so I'm trying to find that high point, line my saw blade up with it, and I am using a little bit higher magnification with my glasses to do this because we're up close and personal with the stone. I want to try and be as precise as possible. You may notice that I'm starting moving forward, and that's actually not cutting as much. I'm trying to make a small divot right at that corner, and I'm also using my thumb as a guide to get it started. Now we've got a little divot going. I'm going to keep, I'm making a cut pushing forward, and I'm actually going with those little teeth. All right, so we've started with the front point. Now we're moving to one of the back sides, finding the keel line, moving forward slowly. This is why I leave the corners as I'm sharpening the top edge of the wall. I leave that a little bit thicker so I have a nice spot to use my saw blade. And I'm going to come back through and thin that out just a slightly before I start setting the stone. You see we got 2 little notches there. Now we're on to notch number 3. All right, went forward, and now I'm going to bring it back just to make a little bit deeper cut right at that corner. It's okay to work a little bit, kind of glance at it, and then work your way around. You can always revisit that corner as well. If you see as you're starting to press your bezel in, if it's not folding the way that you want to, you can make that cut a little bit deeper. So now I'm starting to sharpen up those corners slightly, sharpening right up to my saw cut line. And so after you have these corners sharpened, if you see that, you know, maybe I want to go a little bit deeper with one of these reliefed corners, you can do that because you've already made yourself a guide, making that saw cut through there. It's real important not to, or try not to, cut all the way down to the stone itself. You know, I'm probably within, as I'm looking at this, maybe a 1/4 millimeter. The saw cut comes down, and it's maybe about a 1/4 millimeter from the very point of the stone. So this is a standard piece of steel. That's a square piece of stock, and I just pressed it down into a wooden handle here. And so what you can do to prep this tool, you don't want it to have a very sharp flat edge on the side there. So what you can do is you can kind of take some sandpaper. This again is that 1200 grit. If you have a brand new piece of steel, you may want to start with a higher grit of sandpaper, say maybe a 600, working down to a 400. Some people will high polish the end of the tool. I like it to have kind of a softer finish because it is less likely to slip. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm taking the ring clamp and I'm pressing it up against the half moon back here. So that's gonna provide some stability. The little lip that I cut here as well is also gonna provide stability. But the main stability is coming from my hands. You'll see that I'm holding with my forefinger and my thumb quite a bit, and I'll do a lot of rotating because I'll often start in a corner. If I see something I don't like, I'll move on to the next. And I'm pushing in kind of like a flap. We have the two pieces of metal that have been separated by that saw cut. I'm starting with one, and then I'm going to work the second one over. When in doubt, back out is a good rule of thumb, because if you feel like, this isn't going exactly the way I want it to, you can always come back through there and make another cut. So I started on this side. I'm going to press a little bit more, because as you're pressing down in one corner, the opposite corner is coming up. So you just kind of want to do an even transition all the way around the stone. This corner is already pressed against its neighbor. So what I'm doing is I'm making another saw stroke upward, taking the saw blade, moving forward like that. Now it's no longer pressing against this piece here. So that's going to allow me to push a little bit more. Anytime you come in with the saw, less is more. Do a little bit, press, see where you're at, and start working down the line. Leave that right there for a moment, and I'm going to start using the bezel pusher. These come in steel and brass, and here again, a good way to prep this, just like the smaller pusher, is with the sandpaper. I like to go up and over, similar to how I was filing on the bezel, following that round surface. But what you don't want is a sharp edge on here. So you can just take that, just go a little bit on the edge. That looks a little bit brighter. Here again, if you want it to be high polished, you can certainly do that. I do like about the 1200 grit, as far as, it's nearly polished at that point, but I feel like it's just a little bit less slipping. So now what I'm doing is I'm working on the bezel wall right in the middle. So with this bezel pusher, it's called a roller, and you can see why, because I'm kind of rolling it along that top edge. Although you can use this in the corners, you would have to use it like this. And that's why I kind of like to switch between this and the small square-shaped pusher, because the square shape just seems to me a little bit better suited for working in those corners, in those tight areas. You can see that I'm working at an angle. Eventually, as we get this pushed, I'm going to bring the angle of the tool upward more, till we're working almost vertically straight down on the piece. This is the toughest corner right here. So I've moved this side wall flap all the way down nearly to the very edge of the very edge and the point of the stone. Now what I'm going to be doing is pushing the back wall flap over the top of its neighbor. If I run into a position where the back wall piece is not folding down correctly, you can always go back down through there with your saw blade. That will allow you to push it closer to the stone. In this case, on this corner, the back flap is the bottom flap, and then we're pushing this side one over the top of it. Coming back with the roller, rolling out at an angle, and then almost straight up. Try not to do it all at once. If you go in there with a lot of pressure, what you're going to end up with is a wrinkle. So it's important to observe what you're doing. If you start to see a wrinkle of some sort, move on to the other side and push. because what that can do is it can forgive you of that wrinkle. Pushing down on this side will push the stone up against that wrinkle and often flatten it out for you. The stone helps you do the work. You know, working on a stone with points is kind of finicky work. It's a little less forgiving, but I think the reward in the end is well worth the extra work. It is tricky, and it's just important to keep moving and working with it until you're happy. But don't over push it. Often our magnifiers are our worst enemy, because we're going to see little imperfections that you can't see with the naked eye when you're actually wearing and enjoying the ring. So I think I have it pushed down far enough that we can start some cleanup. So what I'm going to use is a barrette file. What's special about a barrette file is it has the teeth, but then the back side of the file is unfinished. There's no teeth on it at all. When you get a new file like this, it's important to finish the edge. And here again, this one is well worn. You can see it's kind of shiny, and that's because it's just it's been used and loved for many years. But if this file was brand new and I just got it out of the package, what I'd like to do, I would start out with a higher grit than this. This is the 1200 grit sandpaper again. But if it's a brand new file, you may notice that there's some burrs along the edge where that file ends and the back flat part of the file begins. So you want to take those burrs off, but you don't want to run sandpaper against the filing portion of it. You just want to run it along this edge like that. And so what that does, removes any burrs that may potentially nick your stone. And then you can even follow up with some of this, and that's even going to get it even shinier. Back to working with our ring. So we have our top flap that we have to file down right now. I can feel it with my finger. It's a little bit sharp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to file. This is my top flap here. I'm going to file towards the bottom flap. Very carefully keeping the file away from the stone, filing the top flap down to the height of the bottom flap. Go slow. Top flap. I'm kind of testing it with my finger to see if there's still a point, because you have an overlap. You have one piece hanging over the other one, and you're just trying to make a smoother transition. A lot of the finish work is going to be done with burnishers, and so we'll be moving that metal on a microscopic level where you're burnishing the two pieces together, and then that's also going to produce a nice high polish. I'm going to do some polishing before I do the final process of burnishing. It's okay if it has a little bit of a sharp edge. You just don't want something that is completely snagging. You can see when you're looking with your magnification that there is a little bit of a gap, the bottom of the saw cut. And so what I'm doing is I'm just barely going over that. You don't want to file real aggressively on that, because then you're going to expose the cut that you made with the saw, and you'll end up with a little hole at the corner of your bezel. So I think that's pretty good. So I'm going to come back in, removing it from the ring clamp. Assess the situation as far as, you know, how many scuffs and bumps and uglies that you want to clear up. This side has got a little bit of a crease. So I'm going to hit it with the light, the fine sandpaper. And I also slipped with the tool right here. So I'm going to take a little bit of that off very carefully. And then also smoothing the bump a little bit. Here again, do not be too aggressive with this tool because you can file clear through the bezel. It's important not to use the sanding disc or the pumice wheel at those corners where your saw made its cut. We want to save the majority of that work for our burnisher, which I'll get to in a moment. So now you have to be very careful using a pumice wheel, making sure that you don't touch the stone with it as you're using it. And I'm just making that a little bit smoother, a little bit shinier. We're not going for a high polish yet. Okay, now we're returning to the ring clamp. And then we're going to use our burnisher. So what I'm doing is I'm basically pushing down very lightly. This burnisher is also finished to a high polish. This is something that you do want it to not just have a sanded finish, you want it to have a high polish finish. And you can achieve that by going with even a finer grit than the 1200 if you like. You can go all the way to 16 or 1800 grit and then following up with the polishing cloth emery. Now I'm working right at the saw cut, and I'm working up and again, up and down, and then across my top flap. If you can still identify that, you want to push top flap down to bottom flap. Now I'm going to use a pink wheel, and so this is similar to the other wheel that we were just using, except for it's going to be more of a high polish. This one, because it doesn't have as high of a grit, you're less likely to scuff your stone, but you still do have to be, take precautions as you're working closely to the edge of a stone. And so we've got it where I'm looking down from the bird's eye view. It's looking pretty shiny, facing sunny side up. I'm going to work on the bezels where I slipped with my tool the side wall of the bezel, where I slipped with my tool a little bit. Just going lightly. If you feel like at some point you need to back up and use the higher grit pumice wheel to file out any blemishes or anything that you feel is ugly, you can certainly do that. On the back side of this, where we have our large solder seam, you want to try and stay away from your solder seam as much as possible with any pumice tools, because you don't want to expose any solder pits or anything like at this point. Now, going back, it seems like pink seems to be the color for softer polishing. So we're going back with the emery, 3M emery cloth, following our bezel wall carefully. So the final stage of cleanup with the bezel is the final burnishing. And this is a burnishing tool that I made out of a normal fork. And the reason I made this burnishing tool out of a fork is because forks, especially the cheaper the better. Like if you get one from a cafeteria, you'll notice that it'll bend really easy. That's because the steel is very soft. So what I did was I cut off one of the tines of this fork and then reshaped it to a burnishing shape. And this is removable from this piece so that I can use my other fork burnisher as well. And the difference between these two is this one is kind of filed down and polished to a point, and this one is filed down flat on one side and then kind of half round on the opposite side. So depending on the application that you're using it for, you can pick the proper fork burnisher for that job. In this case, I'm using the one that's slightly more pointed. It's not a super sharp point at the end. It is somewhat rounded, and that is because we're going to be working right next to the stone. So if I had, say, a stainless steel piece that's a little bit harder steel, that would be too hard to work right against the stone. Here again, you always have to be careful. If your burnisher has any type of a burr or edge on it, that'll be evident because you could possibly scratch your stone. And what I'm doing is you can feel the top edge of this bezel. So what I'm doing is I'm just working straight along there. Taking what's left of that sharp edge where we sharpened earlier and then curling it around right to the stone. The stone is already tight, so this is just dressing for comfort. You know, here again we have a pointy stone, so we want to make it as user-friendly as possible. If you're looking with the jeweler's loop, you notice that the corner is not pushed down completely to the stone. A pointy stone is a little bit more fragile, and I try to keep that corner somewhat relieved so that you don't chip it. And then if the wearer is wearing the ring and hits it against something hard, this little piece should push down more and not chip the stone. Hey, thanks for tuning in to Cool Tools today. I appreciate you checking out my stuff. I hope that this was helpful in setting trillion stones for you in the future. I know they can be tricky with the points and all, but I think the end result is quite rewarding. Thank you.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.